He thought the black robe granted him invincibility, but when Judge James Boasberg started making questionable calls that shielded political elites, Pam Bondi decided it was time to shake up the system. Standing tall behind a podium in Tallahassee, her presence was commanding. No script, no teleprompter, just a stack of sealed files and a clear, unwavering voice. Her eyes scanned the reporters before her, locking onto every lens, every curious stare. This isn't about politics. This is about trust, and Judge Boasberg has shattered it. That single sentence sent shockwaves nationwide, dominating news cycles and dinner table conversations alike. A sitting federal judge facing criminal charges? It felt more like the plot of a legal thriller than a routine Tuesday morning press conference. Yet, Bondi didn't waver. Her tone remained sharp, slicing through the stunned murmurs in the room. She didn't need a smile. Just 48 hours earlier, quiet whispers had begun circulating within the Department of Justice. Rumors of a sealed file, an internal review, and a highly sensitive case involving Boasberg, a judge whose influence had always been tied more to his connections than his courtroom rulings. Most Americans had never heard his name before. That was about to change. Bondi had been watching him for months. The final straw? A last-minute Friday night ruling in a D.C. courtroom, where Boasberg verbally blocked the deportation of 5 individuals with alleged ties to a violent international gang. His decision, delivered without a written order, sent Homeland Security into a legal gray area. Without official documentation, ICE agents assumed they could proceed, setting off a firestorm. Within hours, reporters swarmed ICE offices while protesters took to the streets. But behind closed doors, something bigger was happening. That same night, Bondi was on the phone with high-level officials at the Department of Homeland Security and the White House counsel. "He's not just misinterpreting the law, he's hiding behind it," she allegedly stated in a confidential call. And that conversation was the catalyst. What the public didn't yet know was that Bondi's team had been quietly gathering evidence for weeks. Former clerks, internal memos, encrypted messages, pieces of a puzzle that painted a damning picture. Bondi wasn't just upset, she was preparing for war. At the press conference, she stopped short of listing every charge, but she made it clear. Obstruction of justice was on the table. Judicial misconduct, too. She hinted at a pattern of decisions that appeared to undermine national security protocols. The room was silent, hanging on her every word. Legal analysts scrambled to assess the fallout. News anchors stumbled over breaking headlines. In online forums and legal circles, one question was whispered over and over. Is this really happening? Pam Bondi had always been known for her tough stance, but this was different. This wasn't a mere political move. It was a direct challenge to a sitting judge, aiming to dismantle his credibility case by case, ruling by ruling. In the days that followed, reactions were split. Critics accused her of a partisan attack. Supporters hailed her as a warrior for judicial accountability. But one fact was undeniable. This wasn't a publicity stunt. Bondi was dead serious. She had lit the fuse. The explosion was imminent. But why Boasberg? And why now? Long before these allegations, Judge James E. Boasberg was considered untouchable. A Georgetown and Yale law graduate, he built a career that placed him in the highest legal circles, from K Street to Capitol Hill. His ascent was seamless, first as an associate judge in D.C., then appointed by President Obama to the U.S. District Court, and later in 2020 as the chief judge of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, where he oversaw some of the nation's most sensitive national security cases. Over the years, his rulings began raising eyebrows. It wasn't one case but a pattern, subtle, yet significant. When the FBI faced scrutiny over flawed surveillance applications, Boasberg was the one reviewing the fallout. His judgments, measured, cautious, some would say too cautious. To critics, it seemed as though he prioritized protecting institutions over enforcing accountability. Pam Bondi had been tracking his decisions, noticing his involvement in high-stakes cases that shaped immigration policy and executive power. Then came the restraining order on deportations. This time, it wasn't just legally questionable. It felt deliberate. Bondi wasn't the only one raising concerns. Within DHS, officials were blindsided. "We got no paperwork," read one internal email. "Are we seriously halting flights over a verbal directive?" But the flights continued as scheduled. That's when Boasberg retaliated, threatening contempt charges against the administration. However, legal experts quickly pointed out a glaring issue. Without a written order, there was no legally enforceable ruling. The lines had been drawn. Pam Bondi wasn't backing down. Boasberg, once a behind-the-scenes figure, was now at the center of a legal and political firestorm. And as the nation watched, one thing became clear. This battle was far from over. Behind closed doors, decisions were being made that didn't sit right with Bondi's team. This wasn't just a procedural misstep. It felt like a deliberate cover-up. Furious, she ordered an exhaustive review of Judge Boasberg's record, not just his rulings, but everything surrounding them. Case management logs, internal memos, scheduling anomalies, and personal correspondence patterns. What emerged was unsettling. An unusual number of undisclosed communications in cases involving encrypted technology, particularly Signal. Signal wasn't just another messaging app in this context. It was quickly becoming a legal minefield. By early 2024, a lawsuit had quietly surfaced, gaining momentum over time. The allegations? Senior officials from the Trump administration had used Signal to make high-stakes decisions on sensitive operations, deliberately avoiding any paper trail. When the case landed in Boasberg's courtroom, alarm bells rang. It wasn't about bias, yet. But his close ties to several individuals named in the discovery process raised questions. Still, he didn't recuse himself. Instead, he tightened control, pushing hearings behind closed doors, sealing witness lists, and limiting media access. Bondi wasn't just annoyed, she was convinced. She believed Boasberg had actively shielded key players, either by suppressing evidence or stalling proceedings until interest faded. The DOJ intensified its probe, subpoenaing emails, tracking call records, and scrutinizing suspicious delays. What they found painted a troubling picture: missed filings, postponed hearings, and unexplained alterations to access logs. Bondi's theory was solidifying. Boasberg wasn't just a bystander. He was strategically protecting people who wanted to ensure these Signal messages never saw daylight. By the time an unrelated deportation order was issued, Bondi had already made up her mind about where this was headed. The only question was when to make it public. But this wasn't just about legal maneuvers. Something personal had pushed her over the edge. Inside DOJ headquarters, in a narrow, dimly lit conference room that smelled of stale coffee and printer toner, Bondi sat surrounded by senior advisors. The white noise machine outside hummed, meant to keep their conversation private. But nothing could mask the tension in the room. "We can't ignore this," she said firmly, staring down Deputy Counsel Arlen Stokes. Between them lay a slim yet explosive folder, one that didn't need to be thick to be dangerous. It contained excerpts from encrypted Signal chats, quietly obtained through a third-party subpoena. Someone connected to the case had decided to cooperate, not by leaking to the press, but by sending the evidence straight to Bondi's office. And there it was, a message sent from a federal staffer to Boasberg 2 months before he took over the Signal case. The wording was vague but unmistakable. "They're planning to release some of it in late March, but don't worry, Jay. I've got it covered on our end." Bondi read it twice, 3 times. Her hands trembled. Stokes downplayed it at first. "It could mean anything," he argued. "Could be taken out of context." She wasn't buying it. "It's not just this message," she shot back. "It's the pattern, the redactions, the verbal orders with no documentation, the closed-door hearings. It's too perfect." Then she said something that shifted the entire trajectory of their response. "I'm not letting this get buried in some Inspector General's report 3 years from now." From that moment, the pace accelerated. The next 72 hours were a whirlwind of legal preparations, PR strategy meetings, and classified briefings with the Office of Legal Counsel. They didn't want a leak. They wanted impact. But there was something the public didn't see. 2 days before the press conference, Bondi made a call to someone she trusted, an experienced federal judge in Phoenix, someone who had been quietly observing the Boasberg situation from afar. No politics, no media spin, just decades of judicial experience and an understanding of power. "You sure about this, Pam?" the judge asked. "I am." "You're going to burn a lot of bridges." "I'm not here to make friends," she replied. "I'm here to clean house." She didn't say it with anger. She said it with clarity. She knew what this would cost her, professionally, maybe personally. But she also knew what it would cost to walk away, because for her, this wasn't just about legal ethics anymore. Earlier that year, a mother in Corpus Christi had written Bondi a letter. Her son, a border agent, had been critically injured in an operation involving 2 suspects linked to Tren de Aragua. They had slipped through the system due to a court-ordered hold. That order, signed by Boasberg. "We can't keep pretending politics don't have real-world consequences," the letter read. "My son's spine is broken. He can't walk, and the man responsible is being shielded by a judge who won't even show his face." Bondi never forgot that letter. She kept it in her desk. So when critics later accused her of making this personal, they weren't entirely wrong. It was personal, but not out of vengeance, out of duty. Once she went public, once she named Judge James Boasberg and confirmed an active investigation, there was no turning back. She was fully in. Her career, her reputation, her credibility, all tied to the outcome of this case. But as the story exploded, another thread began to unravel. Because Signalgate wasn't just about encrypted texts. It was about the people hiding behind them. And the public didn't take long to catch on. Within days, the name Signalgate flooded the internet, dominating TV panels, podcasts, Reddit threads. It wasn't just about a messaging app anymore. It was about who had used it, what they were hiding, and why Judge Boasberg had worked so hard to smother it under layers of legal procedure. And the deeper people dug, the more troubling the story became. Because Signal wasn't new to Washington, but the way it had been used, and protected, was about to shake the system to its core. The Trump administration's actions had sent ripples through the intelligence community. Staffers, legal aides, and even high-ranking officials had quietly adopted a certain app during meetings, claiming it was to minimize leaks. But there was a catch. Signal automatically deletes messages, and in government, where records matter, that was a serious problem. That's what the original lawsuit challenged. It came from a small watchdog group in San Diego, dismissed at first as insignificant. But when documents surfaced, scheduling conflicts, deleted calendar entries, glaring gaps in official records, questions started flying. Then came the names. Not just junior aides. These were heavyweights. A former national security advisor, an undersecretary of defense, even a legal consultant who had once worked directly under Judge Boasberg, reviewing surveillance protocols. Despite these connections, Boasberg stayed on the case. No recusal, no acknowledgement of ties. Instead, he scheduled a pretrial hearing, closed it to the public, and issued a vague statement about procedural reviews. That's when Bondi's team ran out of patience. They cracked Signal's encrypted logs, not a simple task, nor one undertaken lightly. But there was a legal avenue tied to national security, and the DOJ leaned on it hard. What they retrieved wasn't complete, but it was enough. One message stood out: a conversation between a legal assistant involved in the lawsuit and a former DOJ staffer who had once worked under Boasberg. It read, "JB says we'll bury it in pre-trial. No panic. No files go public unless forced." 3 days later, Boasberg ruled to delay discovery. Legally, discovery delays are common. But in context, it seemed strategic, a chess move, blocking exposure. To Bondi, he wasn't a cautious judge. He was a gatekeeper, shielding both political sides from scrutiny. And the longer he remained on the bench, the colder the trail would get. She called an emergency meeting with her legal team. "If we don't act now, this case gets sealed forever. The public never finds out." One advisor hesitated. "You think he orchestrated a cover-up?" Bondi's response was sharp. "I think he knew exactly who would be named. And I think he made his choice." That phrase, "made his choice," would later appear in the Wall Street Journal, The Hill, and NPR. It became a quiet rallying cry for those who saw Bondi's push not as personal vendetta, but as a battle to reclaim judicial integrity from hidden power brokers. What disturbed many wasn't just the secrecy, it was the ease with which it had all been buried. A respected judge, with decades on the bench, had sidestepped, stalled, and shrouded court actions tied to a national security scandal. And every step Bondi took to uncover the truth met swift opposition. One legal organization filed a complaint accusing her of undermining judicial independence. A Yale law professor claimed she was injecting politics into the judiciary. But the public had one simple question. If Boasberg had nothing to hide, why wasn't he cooperating? The answer, it turned out, wasn't just about Boasberg. The deeper Bondi dug, the more names surfaced. By the time she formally filed charges, Washington was already shaking. She stood in the same press room as before, this time flanked by two senior DOJ investigators. No cameras were allowed inside the internal briefing, but reporters lingered outside, capturing muffled words through the gap in the door. Bondi's voice was steady. No grandstanding, just facts. We believe Judge James Boasberg has knowingly obstructed federal investigations, misused his authority to shield certain individuals from scrutiny, and compromised the integrity of our justice system. The Department of Justice is pursuing formal charges. The charges were precise: obstruction of justice, judicial misconduct, willful concealment of evidence, and failure to recuse despite clear conflicts of interest. The legal world exploded. Law firms issued emergency memos. Judges held private meetings. Inside federal agencies, emails mentioning Boasberg quietly disappeared, locked away under restricted access. But what made this case different, what made it real, was what followed. Bondi's office released a handful of internal messages, cleared for public review. None contained classified material, but they painted a damning picture: suggestions of hearings being moved, evidence suppressed, and justice manipulated behind closed doors. To ensure the case stayed within a specific legal circle, a short but telling email surfaced. It read, "Keep this one in my courtroom. Too risky for another judge." Another message, marked personal, hinted at legal maneuvers aligning with upcoming political shifts. It wasn't an outright scandal, not in isolation. But to the public, it smelled like backroom deals wrapped in a judicial robe. Meanwhile, Boasberg went silent. No press statements, no court appearances, no direct denial. Instead, his clerk issued a brief, polished response. Judge Boasberg has always served with honor and integrity and will respond through the appropriate legal channels. But that only fueled the fire. The public wanted answers. They wanted him at a podium, facing questions, showing some semblance of accountability. Instead, his allies spoke for him. Political analysts on major networks rushed to his defense. They called it a witch hunt, accused Bondi of exploiting her office, painting her as someone making an example of judges who didn't align with conservative interests. But for every critic she faced, her base grew louder. Regular Americans, veterans, small business owners, immigration officers began speaking up. Even former clerks who had worked under Boasberg years before started coming forward. Some defended him. More shared whispers, small, unsettling details about rulings and actions that had slipped under the radar. A court translator from Loretto recalled case files vanishing just before a deportation hearing reassigned to Boasberg's courtroom. A paralegal in Ohio remembered being told to delay filing because a friendly judge wanted to take over. No single revelation was a bombshell, but together they painted a troubling picture, and Bondi wasn't done. She gave one last interview before stepping away from the cameras. When asked if she feared the political fallout of charging a federal judge, her response was firm. "Let the consequences come. I'd rather lose my seat than lose my spine." The quote struck a nerve. Within hours, it was printed on coffee mugs, plastered on bumper stickers, and turned into digital ads. Her critics tried to spin it, but the damage was done. The line stuck. Inside the courthouse, preparations for pre-trial hearings moved forward. The process would be slow. Judges rarely face trial, let alone criminal charges. But it was happening, and the nation was watching. Lines were drawn. You were either with Bondi, calling for long overdue accountability, or with Boasberg, defending the judiciary from what some saw as a politically driven attack. Yet, beyond the headlines and courtroom battles, a quieter storm was brewing. This was no longer just about legal proceedings. It was about trust. The case hadn't even gone to trial, but the damage was already spreading. The judiciary, long perceived as impartial and untouchable, was now under scrutiny like never before. In a small, reserved courtroom in Alexandria, Virginia, Boasberg finally appeared. He didn't enter through the public doors. Marshals led him in through a side passage, avoiding the sea of cameras and reporters. His suit was crisp, but his face was drawn, betraying the weight of the moment. Once a guardian of the country's most sensitive legal matters, he now stood as a defendant, flanked by attorneys. The charges were read in steady, emotionless tones. The presiding judge remained composed. No theatrics, no grand speeches, just legal motions and paperwork. Boasberg pleaded not guilty. Outside, the atmosphere was charged. Protesters and supporters clashed on the courthouse steps. Some held signs demanding no more shadow justice. Others waved American flags, chanting Bondi's name. The divide was clear. But underneath the noise, a single question lingered on every face. Can we trust those behind the bench? Judges had always been seen differently from politicians. They didn't campaign. They didn't trade jabs on social media. They ruled, and people accepted it. But now, that illusion was breaking. The system itself felt vulnerable. Bondi remained out of the spotlight in the days after the arraignment. No press tours, no victory laps, just quiet, deliberate movement from her team. But she understood what had happened. She hadn't just filed charges. She had cracked open a door no one wanted to acknowledge. One morning, her assistant walked in, holding a padded envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter, the cursive shaky but deliberate. It was from a retired federal clerk in Santa Fe. I watched Judge Boasberg override a colleague in 2017 on an immigration hold. The case was never reported. No press. The man was released 2 months later. He killed a sheriff's deputy in Oklahoma. We all knew it. The case was just beginning, but the floodgates had already opened. The moment arrived, but no one spoke. Bondi never needed to make the letter public. She didn't have to. The stories were already spilling out, one after another. Some had evidence, some didn't. Some were messy, but all carried a common thread. Whispers of quiet favors to ISM, discreet lunches with federal attorneys, phone calls that left no trace, and rulings that tilted just enough to raise eyebrows, but never enough to demand a reckoning. Still, Boasberg remained silent. His legal team spoke for him, dismissing the case as a blatant overreach. They called Bondi a partisan warrior on a crusade. But they couldn't explain the messages. They couldn't explain the delays. They couldn't explain why sealed court logs had mysteriously disappeared before hearings connected to Signalgate. In Washington, sides were forming. Some legal experts warned that Bondi's pursuit could set a dangerous precedent, one where judges could be hunted down for political reasons. Others argued that accountability wasn't a threat to the system. It was the very thing that upheld it. Senators were divided. Some rallied behind her, while others called for an inquiry into her own office. But Bondi didn't waver. Beneath the headlines and the political noise, something unexpected was happening. Ordinary Americans, people who had never cared much for legal battles or judicial proceedings, were paying attention. They were watching C-SPAN, dissecting court transcripts, following every development. It wasn't about Bondi anymore. It wasn't even about Boasberg. It was about power. Did it still have limits? In coffee shops, kitchen tables, and break rooms across the country, people were having conversations about justice in a way they hadn't in years. But one final moment still had to unfold. The event that would determine whether this was just another political scandal or a true turning point. It was a warm spring evening when the verdict was read. No flashing cameras, no triumphant music, just the sound of a gavel striking wood and the quiet rustling of bodies shifting in their seats. Judge Boasberg was acquitted of some charges. Insufficient hard evidence, missing key messages erased long before investigators could get to them. But 2 charges remained. willful concealment of evidence, and misuse of judicial authority. The courtroom stood still as the clerk read the words. Boasberg didn't react. His lawyers sat motionless, eyes cast downward. The sentence, removal from the bench, permanent disbarment, and a recommendation for further federal review of his past rulings. No jail time, but no redemption either. Pam Bondi didn't gloat. She didn't call a press conference. Instead, she walked into her office, gazed out toward the Jefferson Memorial, and whispered to herself. That was the moment she understood. This had never been about just one man. It never was. In the weeks that followed, something rare happened. For a fleeting moment, the country stopped arguing, not about party affiliations or political games, but about something deeper, truth. For the first time in years, people saw behind the curtain, not into a grand conspiracy, not into some orchestrated deception, but into the deeply human, flawed machinery that powered the justice system. One former clerk from Boasberg's court spoke anonymously. "He wasn't a villain," she said. "He thought he was doing the right thing, but that's not enough, not when you wear that robe." And that was the point Bondi wanted people to understand. Power, real power, wasn't about the speeches made in front of cameras. It was about the choices made in the quiet, when no one was looking. Boasberg had chosen secrecy, silence, self-preservation. Bondi had chosen transparency, even at great personal risk. The impact rippled beyond Washington. Letters arrived at her office from people who had suffered in silence, families who felt abandoned by the justice system. A father in Wichita whose son had been deported despite being cleared of all charges. A woman in Bakersfield whose sister had been assaulted by a man released under a deferred hearing, one that passed through Boasberg's courtroom without a single public record. These weren't just sob stories. They were real lives, real consequences. And for Bondi, that was always the point. In one of her rare public appearances after the trial, she stood before a class of first-year law students at the University of Florida. No notes, no script. Just her voice. "Don't chase headlines," she told them. "Chase the truth, because if you don't, someone else will write your version of it for you." The room fell silent. Some students scribbled notes, others just stared, wide-eyed. While her critics still called her reckless, new voices were rising. Tougher questions were being asked. How many other judges had made quiet decisions in the shadows? How many rulings weren't about justice at all, but about shielding the system from scrutiny? The Justice Department took notice. A new review system for judicial complaints was quietly implemented. It didn't make front-page news, but it mattered. Because now, someone was watching. And that's what real accountability is. Not fear, not retribution, but presence. The willingness to pay attention. Pam Bondi had left a mark. Not a wound, but a bruise. And sometimes, a bruise is exactly what's needed, to remind a system of its weaknesses. As the media cycle moved on, Boasberg faded into obscurity. He left Washington, his name slipping from the headlines. But the echo of his downfall remained, lingering in courtrooms where other judges now sat, their robes crisp, their verdicts yet to be written. Let this be the lesson. Even the highest bench can crack. And when it does, the question isn't how far the fall, but what the rest of us learn from it. If you believe justice must always come with accountability, don't stay silent. Subscribe for more stories that bring the truth to light.